Thanks everyone for coming. I think we'll go ahead and get started. In this room, unfortunately, the entrances are right by the stage, so sometimes people look in and realize they're right there, and then they go around and try the other side. And anyhow, if that happens, there's no shame in it. Don't let it throw you. But we're very glad you all made it. Thank you for coming. Thank you for taking this issue seriously. My name is Laura Helmuth. I'm the health and science editor at the Washington Post, which is a publication that the President of the United States regularly refers to as an enemy of the American people. So we've always been, at the Post, we've always been kind of a target for hackers and disinformation campaigns and doxing and threats. It's gotten a lot worse in the past few years, so we've been trying to increase our security protocols to protect ourselves. And what's also happened in the last few years is a lot of people have been eager to share information with us. A lot of whistleblowers, a lot of people who work for the government or are in other positions where they have information that they want us to have, but they can't be revealed as being the source of it, otherwise they could lose their jobs. So what we've been doing is just making it really easy for people to share information with us at the Post. So this is just a screenshot of our homepage, and I've highlighted, there's just a little module that says share tips with us. And when you click on that, you get your choice of 5 different ways. And we keep trying different systems, different software, different apps for our phones. So we're all on WhatsApp, we're on Signal, encrypted email, and these are all the codes, and you can click on this to find out more and to do it. And I think most publications have this now. If you don't yet, other publications can help you install things like this at your own place. So I'm just so this is the screenshot at the top of the page, and as you scroll down, the final 2 are secure drop and then postal mail. You can print something out, stick it in an envelope, and mail it to us. And we pay a lot more attention to our mailroom than we used to, because this is a way that a lot of people use, just very low tech, very secure, as long as you avoid fingerprints and take some basic security protocols. So that's what we're doing to sort of protect the data coming in, or make it easy, make it inviting for people to share information with us safely and securely. We're also doing a lot of training internally, because a lot of the times when information is compromised is because of human error. So we have regular trainings on data security, and we're tested often. People tend to find out the hard way because they'll get a phishing email, and if you click on the link, it goes to our IT, our technical department, and they say, gotcha, that was a phishing scam. You never should have clicked on this, and we're gonna make you take a mandatory security retraining right now, and again in 3 months, and we're gonna just stay on you until you learn your lesson. So, but everybody has to learn their lesson. It's hard to constantly be vigilant, and so these reminders are helpful. And of course, it's very, very important. The most important thing we do is reveal the truth, and as important is protecting the people who share the truth with us. And people are taking risks to their reputation, their careers, their freedom, in some cases their lives. So it's very serious to take security seriously. And so we'll talk today about some of the techniques you can use to do that. But even more than individual techniques, it's a mindset. It's an awareness that there are threats. It's sort of it's a matter of keeping up with technology, using things that work, using the right tools, finding people where they are, but also just always being aware that people are trying to find your data. And even if they're not, if you are sloppy with it, if you're the least bit careless, things will get out that you really don't want to get out. And so we've brought people from around the world to talk to you about it today. And so we're really grateful to have our speakers. I'll introduce them in the order they're going to present, and they'll each have a description of what they're doing, and then we'll have a conversation among ourselves and also with questions from you. I've got a few questions from Twitter too, so feel free to well, actually I don't have my computer, but I'll share those questions from Twitter. And our speakers, so we have Julien Martin, who's a computer scientist. He's studied artificial intelligence, including automated reasoning, knowledge representation, machine learning, natural language processing. And he works at ICIJ, the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. And he's designing and developing a project called DataShare, which is software for collaborative and data-driven investigative journalism. And then we'll have Wael Iskander Abu Hadid. He's a journalist and a technologist. He participated in the Egyptian Revolution, including reporting and political analysis. And his technology work now includes digital protection for NGOs and activists. And he's worked with human rights organizations in Egypt and other countries. Right now, he's working with Tactical Tech on a program called Exposing the Invisible, which has a focus on making investigation techniques available and safe for civic engagement. And then finally, we'll have Dana Priest, who's a reporter at the Washington Post, and she's also the Knight Chair in Public Affairs Journalism at the University of Maryland. She also has written and writes for The New Yorker and PBS Frontline. She's won many awards, including the 2008 Pulitzer Prize for Public Service for The Other Walter Reed, which is about the VA hospital system in DC, and also a Pulitzer for reporting on CIA secret prisons and counterterrorism operations. And she just recently won a Peabody Award for a Frontline documentary about Facebook. So thanks to all of them for coming. Again, they'll give their presentations and then we'll all talk, and we'll have microphones for your questions as soon as they're done. Thanks.
Hello, my name is Julian Martin. I worked during 3 years at the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, where I started and led the work on the next collaborative search and discovery tool at ICIJ. First, there is no such thing as a perfectly secure solution. So, sorry, it's not displaying. Sorry about that. There's no such thing as a perfect solution and a secure solution. So you have to know that most dangers come from the false sense of security, coming from ignorance or misunderstanding of technology. So that's very important to understand what you're using and using technology only when needed. You also have to take your decisions depending on your context, your threat model. A threat model is just the identification of what you want to protect, from whom, and then what your enemy can do and what you can afford. This will lead adequate self-defense strategies. So I'd like to first share with you very basic and practical tips and tools on data security. First, you should stop creating passwords and start generating passphrases, which are usually stronger and easier to remember. That's really simple. Just take 4 or 5 random unrelated words, and that would do the trick. You may also want to remember only one of them, and a password manager will help you generate and store securely unique and strong passwords for all your digital accounts. KeePass is such a good option working at ICIJ. In addition, speaking of user accounts, it's highly recommended to set up a second step of verification in addition to your password or passphrase. For instance, you can install a Google Authenticator, which will generate a unique code at each login time on your phone, the phone that you own. It could be a fingerprint or anything else, but that's an option. And this is very important. Then you have to be prepared in case of one of your devices gets stolen, or your devices get checked at borders. So the solution is to have to use the full disk encryption on all your devices, smartphones, disks, and laptops. If, in addition, you want to accept more data from potentially anonymous sources, make Secure Drop installed at your organization. You may also want to share specific sensitive files with your collaborators. And if you're not already, get familiar with PGP encryption and generate your own key pair. And very important, never reveal your private key, keep it for yourself. If you have to choose any tool, choose tools that follow the OpenPGP standard. They exist on all platforms. Fortunately, there are softwares that make your life a bit easier, and you'll be able to use your webmail, Gmail, or traditional Thunderbird by adding some plugins like FlowCrypt Mail Envelope or Enigmail. And they will send and store emails encrypted with PGP. But an important thing is that the most secure email is the inexistent email. So just get rid of your messages as soon as you can, actually. In addition, you may want to talk or to send instant messages with your fellow journalists or any source. And Signal is, well, not perfect. Nothing is perfect, but the most mature and the most widely used secure messenger out there. So again, set a message expiration. And another thing is to understand that content and messages is not all. Data about your messages, like who you're talking to, at what time, when you're talking to them, and how often, can reveal as much information as the conversation itself. To such an extent that most intelligence agencies, organized crime groups, leverage metadata, and actually, in most cases, they don't even need the content of a conversation because they can connect the dots by just observing who you're talking to, when, and how often. So beware of the metadata. You may want to hide some of the metadata by using Tor, by connecting to the internet with Tor over what we call a virtual private network. It's a bit complicated, so we don't have time to dig into it. But again, notice that that's a really complicated topic, and because it's complicated, it can be counterproductive. In short, prefer passphrases, use passphrases, use two-factor authentication on all your accounts, encrypt data and communications, and minimize data lifetime. These simple 4 tips have proven successful at ICIJ with hundreds of journalists. So that's the minimum. Then beware of the metadata, as I said, and a good strategy might be to spread information over different channels, including the physical. And choose your software, choose open source software and mature technologies. And if you can, run software on your own machine you can control. And if you can, just try not to use technology and do the old-fashioned way. If you can't mitigate risks, if you think you're endangered and you have to drop your story, but you want it to be published, you can reach Forbidden Stories, which is a network of journalists that can pick up the investigation, complete it, and publish it. Now I'd like to present the work we've done at ICIJ. DataShare. DataShare is a search and discovery tool, a collaborative search and discovery tool. And we've done it so in the context of the ICIJ, which is a large network of investigative journalists, and with a data journalism team. well, ICIJ has published the Panama Papers, you may know. Panama Papers were kind of 10 million documents and a lot of data, so we had to set up large system to dig in it. As of today, more than $1 billion have been recovered by sovereign states following the Panama Papers. So, until data share, the large system dealing with all these documents was centralized. Each journalist was connecting to a central platform with two-factor authentication, encryption, etc. But the documents were at a single place. The idea with data share is to make a global network and leverage all the information and data that all the journalists in the network own. Data share has been designed with security in mind. It's an open source project. It can run on your own machine, and it creates a distributed network of journalists. You can use two-factor authentication, and it allows anonymous credentials, so that anonymity can be guaranteed. And the security work has been held in collaboration with the Security and Privacy Engineering research team at EPFL, a few blocks away. So let's consider Gabriela. She's a journalist. She lives in Brazil, and she collected a huge amount of documents, and she just can't read it all. She's on a government minister contract price fixing story, and the fictional minister will consider his name João Silva. With data share, Gabriela is able to process all of the documents and do a search on her own platform, on her on her laptop side. So she searches for João Silva, and it leads to a few names and organizations, as well as locations that are mentioned within the documents where João Silva appears. So she can learn quickly that Lucas Machado, who is the CEO of Engenharia Incorporation in Sao Paulo, is mentioned together with João Silva. How does it work? First, data share processes all your files and make from them a single index on which you can search. So you can extract text from all your documents, from emails to PDFs to spreadsheets. And an additional step is to extract all the names from the documents, like all the locations, persons, people, and organizations. Data share is a global network, so once Gabriela has processed her files, she may be blocked at some point, and she would be able both to share and to get new information from the network. For instance, she'd like to know if anyone on the network owns documents about João Silva. She sends an anonymous request over the network. Unfortunately, a positive answer arrives. She doesn't know who answered yet, but she asks for the documents, access for the documents. But the owner wants to know who she is and what is she searching for. So Gabriela answers, and before sharing, Anastasia, who's working in Russia, wants to have a conversation. After the conversation, Anastasia will share the documents with Gabriela. And that's it. Thank you. You can have some references. This presentation is online, and you can find it whenever you want. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm gonna thank you, Julian, for this presentation. Covered a lot of really practical tips. I'm gonna talk about digital protection, and I'm gonna give a brief introduction. It's not gonna go into that many details, but I'm just gonna talk about contextually what is digital protection and how we should care about it and how to talk about it. So I want to start with a sad story. This is Ismail Iskandarani. He's an Egyptian researcher. And on 29th November 2015, he was heading back from Berlin after attending a conference to Hurghada to visit his mother who was sick. And he had been writing about sort of a forbidden area, which is the war in Sinai and the dealings of the military with the militants there, and uncovering a lot of questions there. On his way back, he got stopped in the airport, and he was already a target, but they were looking through his files, and then they found deleted files that actually hadn't been deleted completely and restored it, and they used it to further their evidence. And basically what I think Ismail had thought is that if he deleted it in a certain way and using like a software called Eraser or something, it would be completely gone. But the update is that when you're using an SSD hard drive, you can't delete it anymore like this. You have to do very different techniques in order to delete it, and that's why they were able to recover it. It's not exactly the reason he's ended up, he got a 10-year sentence in the military jail, but it's not the exact reason, but it's some of the supporting excuses that were given to land him there. And I think the main purpose I'm saying this story is because digital protection, like it won't protect you completely. It can help you a little bit, but you have to think more about everything, all in all, in order to move forward. So this is a very specific case where you have someone writing about a contentious topic, and the digital security here has come into, to play a great role in their safety. You might think, but that doesn't apply to anything else. But as we move towards more oppressive governments or actors, the truth becomes an enemy that puts you at risk. And this is the importance of digital safety nowadays. It's increasingly so. Also, excuse the extreme examples from Egypt, but this is basically where my experience comes from. But there were people also writing about culture and heritage and things like that. And you'd think this is a very safe topic. But due to some corruption networks, there was a lot of interest as well in like taking over heritage sites and selling antiquities and so on. So that kind of coverage became contentious. And so something as innocent as writing about your usual heritage and culture, it becomes contentious when someone's trying to maximize profit out of that. Also, even if we go further into science, we have this really famous scientific story or non-scientific story where the Egyptian military announced in February 2014 that they had discovered a cure for AIDS. And basically it was using this gun array that would just obliterate AIDS remotely, and it was announced by a general of sorts, and it was a platform that they ran on to say that Egypt is great and so on, at which point it became dangerous to actually counter that narrative, even by people who knew science. So eventually this didn't take off because there was no really scientific basis, but the idea of reporting on something, even if you're just reporting something which is basic, becomes something that's very dangerous. Journalists in Egypt of all types have are quite scared to go through airports rightfully so, because they're afraid that their devices would be searched or they would be deported or something. And it doesn't matter if they have anything contentious. So this is where it comes into play. This is why awareness of, the digital is quite important. And one thing I want to also say is that it's integrated into our lives. It's not separated. We've at Tactical Tech, we've been kind of doing a lot of security trainings, and we're teaching a lot about tools. But as we go along, it doesn't stick. Security tools don't really stick. And as Julian was saying, it's about the threat model. It's the function you're trying to do and what you're trying to protect yourself against. That's most important. That's how you go forward and learn. So what are we trying to do and what are we trying to protect? We can protect things like our documents, our sources, our communications. And then here's a responsibility that we have. If you're contacting someone and that contact puts them at risk, your choice of how to do it digitally makes all the difference. You can't just call someone when their phone is tapped. Maybe it's better to message them. There's no foolproof solution, right? But we have to think about the kind of risks that we put people in and what we're trying to protect them from. Also, I was doing a lot of reporting myself and also doing a lot of technical training and security training. I was helping out NGOs and activists starting from 2012. 2012, I would give a security training, and I would talk about just various tools that were quite vital, and people weren't really listening because it adds an extra step. You just have to, open your password manager. You have to install Tor. You have to do one of these things. So fast forward 2013, crackdown based on digital information happens, and announcing a training got a lot of people in the room because they'd seen their friends not being careful digitally, what happens to them. In a sense that digital security or protection, you try your best against what you perceive can happen, and it's good to know it, but you only put it to use if you think that it fits some of the threat. Being overcautious is not bad, as long as you have a sense of why you're doing it. So I would just like to say, we talk about securing your things in one specific way, but we can look at it in two different ways. Recovery and sensitivity. We're talking about what are you trying to protect, how? Are you protecting, I'm simplifying it into a fire versus a raid. So you have a place where fire happens and you want to get that information again, or if there's a raid or an intercepted information, is it sensitive that you don't want the person intercepting it to read it? These are two different aspects that when you're planning for your security that you want to know what kind of data you're holding and what you're trying to do. For example, as well, we have people who have uploaded a lot of human rights violation videos on YouTube, and then their account got suspended. And now all this evidence is gone without a real backup. The threats here are not just they're not just governments or malicious actors. They're also big tech companies who can choose to suspend your online presence, which you've helped build. They can suspend your account. They can be pressured by governments to do such a thing. They can reveal information, and this is a kind of security that you also can think about. When journalists are arrested in Egypt, what they want to do is deactivate their Facebook account because any of the status messages they leave can be seen as evidence. And so basically there's a feature where you have trusted people that do that, but what if you don't? So as a matter of necessity, friends of the journalists have thought of this way of reporting that account so that Facebook sees it in violation, and the mass reporting actually helps shut it down. In that sense, this idea of safeguarding their friends or safeguarding themselves is become a necessity that they need in order to protect themselves, and try to protect their friends who might have this evidence against them. I want to say as well that when it comes to data protection, protecting your digital self, there's no such thing as a one-size-fits-all. There's not one thing will happen that will protect you. What you're doing will determine what you do to safeguard yourself. And there are things that, if we're going to be honest about it, is things that you can't help. For example, like the story that broke out about China installing spy software on tourist devices in order to track them. They get their emails, their names, and so on. This is all the stuff that really, like, we can try and work to avoid, but it's always something that's integrated into our usual lives. And there was a session earlier that talks about the difficulty of talking about science and communicating it, because science permeates all our lives, but when we talk about it, it feels like such an isolated topic to some people, although they're present. And I think security is also the same. We talk about it so separately, but basically it's not just digital. It affects our lives, and now that everything that we do is digital, it permeates all that. And finally, I would just a few words about what we're trying to do in my current setting. With the project Exposing the Invisible is about investigations. And what we've tried to do is we got experienced investigators who use research techniques like whatever, Google dorking, like searching for companies, and we brought them all together in a simple, like a beginner's kit, and telling them how to start doing these techniques and researching safely, with as safely as it can be, with digital tools and offline tools, with giving that kind of approach of a safe way to start research. And we've tried to compile that, and the workshops we do are based on how to do investigations and how to secure yourself while doing that, combining both. And I think that's what sticks most, because people will always try and relate security to a certain function that they're doing and a certain risk that they're trying to avoid. Thank you.
Hello. So happy to be here. I feel like I should give you a little historical context about why we are where we are. Really has to do with what the US and Western militaries and intelligence agencies did after 9/11 to try to find and kill or capture the Al-Qaeda network. I reported on that a lot for the Post, and when I look at what was developed, what wasn't able to happen back then, in other words, what capabilities our countries did not have to find terrorists or suspected terrorists and to capture them or kill them, that was the #1 priority. And so they built systems that didn't exist in a very quick way that have a lot to do with being able to aggregate anything that's digital and any sort of what I would call digital exhaust, so that weapon systems could come in almost real time and eventually in real time to fire armed drones, which we also didn't have much of before, and to kill or send troops in to capture these suspected terrorists, Al-Qaeda. So fast forward to today, the wars have, dragged on, but certainly downsized. The companies, and in a lot of cases the people who were involved with all this, have found new markets. And the new markets that they've found are largely civilian and domestic. The laws of all of our countries are far behind where these weapon systems are right now. Well, I shouldn't call them weapon systems, but that's how they were developed. And so we are really living that. We're living the demilitarization or the militarization of civilian and law enforcement worlds. It's helped to find real criminals, but it's also leads us to our discussion today. And so, think of yourselves as a target. You're either the state's target, which is, akin to a terrorist back then, or in Egypt, akin to what they would call a terrorist today, a journalist, or a corporation's target, Facebook. You are a monetary target in the sense that they want to sell you your data and they want to sell you products, but also civilian law enforcement who is using things like mobile cell phones. Mobile cell phone towers are things that mimic cell phone towers. They're called stingrays. They're using it in all kinds of ways to catch people. While the laws of the United States in that particular case have not caught up, we have not adjudicated whether these are appropriate or unconstitutional yet. So just to set that in your mind for a second. So I was asked to first do a really quick, overall threat to journalists and your sources, because this is about protecting your sources. But so I just threw some numbers up. These come from the Committee to Protect Journalists, and they have a great data bank, and you can go and they update it. But so we've got about this many people in prison, and the top imprisoners are Turkey. That's relatively new, a couple years old. China, that's very old. And China is very difficult, probably the most difficult country to try to even get health information about these prisoners. Egypt is now up there, and that also declines and increases given the facts on the ground. And then we have our old friends, Saudi Arabia and Eritrea, who likewise have kind of ebbed and flowed with, the whims of the monarchs or whatever. Oops, here we go. So threats to whistleblowers, I just put up here a couple people, very well-known. Julian Assange's case is being very debated in the United States. I think mainly because in his last iteration, he probably conspired with, he accepted documents from the Russians, most likely, and he publicized those. And so a lot of people who were his defenders before, because they were journalists and they actually printed and published a lot of his leaks from WikiLeaks, turned against him. And so that began a debate in the United States. And it was really a debate over whether Julian Assange's personality was, appropriate to that of a journalist. I think that the US media, where a lot of this criticism has happened, has forgotten that whatever happens to Julian Assange may have consequences for the conventional media. Because right now, the US courts have not had to really define what a publisher is versus someone else. And once they start defining that, it's not going to be good for anybody. The other lesson from the Assange case is that if you're up against a state as your nemesis, you don't have much hope. What did they do to finally get the evidence they needed to charge him? is they were able to find his fingerprints on the DoD computers that Chelsea Manning used, and they were able to recreate the jabber conversations that the two of them had. So really, if you're up against, you know, a Defense Department or a Intel service, they have tools that they just never had before, and you're not going to do so well in the end if they decide that you're a problem. Okay, so I just went through that already. So my solution to all this is a little bit different than the ones you've heard here. I'm calling it the flower pot method, and I'll tell you why in a minute. So the one advantage to being older than most of you here is that I actually got to work for 20 years on investigative stories before the digital era. So I want to tell you it's possible. It's actually probably more fun because you get to meet people. And I've been in the business now for 30 years, and it's a lot of hard work, it's a lot of stress, but it's so rewarding. And one of the reasons it's so rewarding is that you get to talk to people that you never thought you would ever get to talk to, and occasionally you get to find out things that you cannot believe that you found out. And that's a kind of like personal thrill that has kept me going, you know, I'll just say, in addition to the differences that you can make in policy and practice in your own countries. So back to the flower pot method. I wanted to tell you a story about two of the most famous digital era investigative projects. I'm sure you're familiar with them, and I'm just going to go very quickly, but the first one is Watergate. So when Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein were investigating what ended up to be President Richard Nixon, and ended up resulting in his stepping down as president, something that hasn't happened yet, ever before. I didn't say that. They did a couple things that I think are really basic and really do work. So they arranged face-to-face meetings, usually under the cover of darkness. They had pre-arranged places that they had discussed with their sources ahead of time, so they didn't have to discuss it on the phone. And the sources probably made contact with them, not through the various technical means, but in those days you could go to what's called a payphone. I don't even know if they have them throughout Europe anymore, but they're very hard to find in the US. Or, as we'll talk a little bit later about how you can find a phone that's not yours to call somebody, not a cell phone. So they were contacted by people through hard lines, as you call them today, and set these things in motion. So the flower pot. When Bob Woodward had a question that he was doing daily reporting on this thing that ended up being called Watergate, but started out as a break-in into an office building of the Democratic Party. He would, when he had a question for his source, who he codenamed Deep Throat, who we learned later was a high-ranking FBI agent, he would move the flower pot on his balcony from one place to another. He also had stuck a red flag in the flower pot to make sure that it could be seen. It's a very simple thing, but it worked. His source would do another trick. So if his source wanted to meet him to give him information, you know, that he had newly acquired, he would write. So Woodward got a newspaper, the New York Times, and the Washington Post, every morning, and he would pick it up and he would turn to page 20. And if the source, who I'm assuming delivered the paper, if the source wanted to meet him, he would circle the 20 at the page. and he would write what time as if the circle was a clock. So they had set the system up. You know, personally, for me, it's easier than using PGP keys, although obviously a lot more time-consuming. But that's how they met. I mean, that's how they would work it out. In another famous case in the United States, the Pentagon Papers, again, the source, Daniel Ellsberg, who was the Defense Department analyst, so he had a security clearance. One assumes that even back then, those people were under certain kind of counterintelligence measures by the United States government. He used a payphone and called a reporter at the New York Times and set up a meeting. He had walked out of the Pentagon with a bunch of paper documents over a long period of time, never gotten caught. This, by the way, still happens today at other agencies, including the National Security Agency. He photocopied those on a photocopy machine that was not his and, you know, not in his possession, but was a friend's, and, you know, created these many stacks of documents and many copies, actually, of the Pentagon Papers, because he thought, if the New York Times is going to get in trouble for this, which they did temporarily, I want to make sure some other papers in the country have it and can print it. So he was like a human thumb drive, and he really thought ahead of time about the law and how the law could stop it. And so while the New York Times gets a lot of credit for being the first to publish, there were actually a dozen newspapers throughout the country that were able, once the New York Times had to stop publishing because that's what the court told them they had to do, there were other papers in the country that published certain elements. But again, my point to you is payphone to connect to another hard line, which was the desk phone at Woodward's office that went through the general number at the Washington Post, and then paper copies and distributed by hand. Either he did it or he had some friends who were, we learned much later, who helped him with it. Okay, so that's the flower pot. That is actually the real balcony, Bob Woodward's balcony. There's no more flower in the pot, but that's the balcony. There's Daniel Ellsberg. Here's the front page of the Pentagon Papers, which when you read it today, it looks like no big deal because it was talking about history. And just look at how look at the title. It's so downplayed. Pentagon study, of growing U.S. involvement. I mean, today it would be like lies, distortions, you know, failed missions or something. It would not be at all like this. Okay, let's see, where am I going now? Okay, so I wanted to talk now about how you can, you know, think about some methods. I want to talk about methods. And I've used all of these. So mainly I've reported on national security. So again, my adversary is a state. The people that I deal with are somehow either directly or indirectly involved with secrets that the government has, but this applies to any other area, medical, drug companies, you know, any type of place that is large. It definitely could apply to a corporation which has the ability to buy information to find you, or it probably has its own insider threat designs on computers and keystroke detection and all that. So one of the first things I do when I start to have a new set of sources is I give them each a code name that I can remember. And, you know, we'll all have little tricks in our head that will allow us to do that. So I have a code name for everybody. If I have a collaborator journalist, we share that name. And so we always call that person by the code name so that when we're speaking in the newsroom or anywhere else, we don't have to discipline ourselves. We just use the code name. Now, I'll say that I think the newsrooms are the leakiest, some of the leakiest organizations around. And I've tested this when I started really getting into sources that just could not be, that were very sensitive, I would test my editors by asking them about stories other reporters were working on. And the editors that actually would eventually tell me the sources of the reporters, there's no way that I would ever tell that person the real name of a source. So even, you know, in best intentions, it just happens. Meeting places. All right. I was going to ask some of you for your examples, so think about that if you want to add to the conversation. But some of the meeting places, so you want a meeting place, I think, that is not totally isolated and weird, so that if you know, someone were to see you in a place that, you know, people aren't supposed to be or adults aren't normally there, it won't draw attention. So I'll just give you a couple of my favorite meeting places. And I surveyed some of my colleagues too. So places that are public, museums, universities, big parks, not little parks, big parks, semi-busy streets where you can go into a car and it wouldn't be odd that people are sitting in a car because they're either coming or going from a parking place. Other institutions, you know, that I think you can go through your mind's eye and look at the city that you're in. Parking garages actually are a place I've used a lot. And the first time I did, I said to myself, I can't believe I'm sitting in a parking lot in a car. But, and in a car is a really good place too, because I've had many conversations, and this is something other people, my sources introduced me to. This is a world that they were more familiar with than I was, but driving the car. You know, we're driving a car and they're talking. In one case, one of the more, how should I say this? Sensitive sources was driving a car very fast through a big city. I'm like, why are you doing this? And I felt like I was circling around and da-da-da. And he said, well, I'm trying to evade a tail. And that person was actually a current employee. And, you know, it's very possible that he was actually being tailed. So cars are a great location. Instead of using email or putting notes on your computers, how about writing them down in scribbly handwriting and putting them somewhere where, you know, you only know. Now, you can't, in the United States and I think elsewhere, if you were ever to get a warrant, you can't destroy the notes or else you would be, you could be charged with obstruction of justice, but that's very rare. In fact, I don't know of that happening anytime recently. But if you have, so again, don't think about living without a cell phone, living without computer notes, living without email. It actually has happened. People did this for years. And you should try just leaving your cell phone at home. Don't take it with you, because even when cell phones are off, if your adversary is a state, they can recreate enough of the data to figure out your pattern. Okay, let's see. Where would you get, if you had to call somebody and you didn't want to use your phone, anybody have any ideas about where you could go to, where's a phone that you could use? Have any of you done this? Where's a phone that you could use that's not your phone, and it's not your friend's phone? Yes, hotels, perfect. I used to call a source only when I was at a hotel, on a hotel phone, and we never had any communications other than that. So it was difficult, and I never rented a room just to call, but I was at hotels enough. Anybody else? A bar? Was that, yeah? They have phones there? Yep. Any other examples? Yeah.
Library?
Yeah, library.
In India, we have public booths.
Yes. Bring back the public phone. How about law firms or big businesses, where you go and you have to do one thing and you say, oh, can I borrow your phone? Or again, in the United States, we have a lot of think tanks or non-governmental organizations. They often have large buildings and lots of phone lines and that sort of thing. Or even government offices, I got to borrow your phone for a minute. So there are a lot of areas. You just have to, think about it ahead of time. And then email, how about using the Postal Service? You have to have, again, in the United States, they have to have a warrant in order to open your mail. It's going to be it's very unusual for them to get a warrant against a reporter. It does happen, but you can mail it from some other location. And I've done this a number of times. It takes a while. And you have to find a typewriter. That was actually the biggest thing, is that I had to find a typewriter in the newsroom, which was not easy, but it can be done. You can actually buy those really cool old ones now. And then, of course, the face-to-face. I mean, that is really the best. It's best for some other reasons we're going to talk about for a minute, in a minute. And then finally, protecting your sources extends to what you publish. Because if you have a really exquisite, unique document, and you're so excited to get this because it will tell your readers that, you really got the goods, think a lot about what details you're going to use in that. So I'm working on a story right now where I have medical records that I shouldn't have. And I know if I use the term medical record, that's going to set off a number of alarm bells that I don't want to set off. So instead of medical record, I could say internal document. It's not as good. I could say the internal document of the institution that I'm talking about, and it's still good enough because I'll then quote from it. But if I said medical records, and we have the whole health privacy issue, which I know that you do too, that's going to be a violation of something beyond whistleblowing that would give the government or the institution a reason to go into their computer systems and look for who that was. Dates, you might want to never make up things, never say something that's false, but you could, instead of using a day, and a month, you could use the month, or you could just use the year. I mean, we all love these details, but I think you have to be careful about which ones you use. And then finally, how about delaying publication for several weeks, like just sitting on a document, so that the proximity to you and the publication date doesn't give something away to the institution that might be looking for your source. And I've done this both on purpose and also because stories took a lot longer to actually come to fruition. Okay, so I also want to end with some quick suggestions on how to find sources, because I know that some of you haven't done investigative work, but you'd like to, and it's not always, obvious. So I didn't write this up here. I don't want to give away all my trade secrets. So you're going to have to take notes, but I would start with, this is going to sound basic, newspaper or clips, we call them clips, stories that you can find online. If you're doing, whatever you're doing, read what someone else has done that's like that, or kind of like that, and just take all the names out of that story. That's your first potential sources. People they might have quoted on a daily story, but actually are involved in, the fire department that you're looking at. Just, get a list of names, and you'd be amazed at how many you can get that way. Then I would try first to find the people that you want to talk to when they step out in public. In other words, don't call them up blindly on the phone and expect to have a conversation. Try to find where they are interacting in public. So a couple examples. conferences. At least in the United States, there are a ton of conferences for every kind of association of this and that you can imagine. All sorts of government officials, former government officials go to these things, as do, corporate execs, middle management. Find out what the association is that they belong to, and then try to see if they or other people, if you're dealing with the pharmaceutical companies, they have conferences all the time, and you'd be amazed at who actually comes. And then you have to figure out a way to approach the person that you're targeting, or the type of person that you want to target and get to know, in a way that they'll be open. And I would suggest that you don't start off with a sensitive topic, but that you keep in mind that everybody, just like yourselves, has a lot of pride in the work they do. They really would like to share it with someone because everyone around them knows what they do. But to have a reporter be interested in what they do, just the basics of what they do and how important it is, and being respectful of their culture. When I covered the Pentagon, I only wore 2 colors, navy blue and gray, all the time. I always try to assimilate the culture that I'm covering. And that includes the language, the acronyms, the shortcuts, the lingo, even kind of the mannerisms. I don't, want to go overboard. But I have had many people when I covered the military say, "Are you from a military family?" And it was only because I really paid attention to the acronyms and the shortcuts that people use in the language. And it's a key. It's an amazing key. People think, "Oh, this person really understands me." And they just open the door a little bit. It's actually quite amazing. So back to the meeting. So think tanks, again, I've been to some of these in Europe where there are intel people. And then so if they're there, you got every other kind of professional at think tanks as well. The UN and the EU, they all have panels come together of experts, including experts that you will never get on the phone because they're just not available. But you can go to the panel discussion and get them in the hallway and exchange cards and be nice and be curious and figure out a way to go have drinks with them. That is also one of my best. It's an amazing thing, but alcohol used in the appropriate way to get your sources to loosen up is so fundamentally amazing that I try to advocate. Sometimes I teach, so I tell this to my students, and they, I had one say, "But my ethics teacher said I'm not allowed to ever quote anybody who's drunk." I didn't say drunk, I just said, I'm like, well, that person must never have been a journalist then. But it honestly will work with any profession. Finally, I'll wrap this up, but 2 of my favorite, Anna Wild gave us a great method too in her discussion yesterday. She says she goes to universities and says, "What's the best research you have going on?" It's a brilliant way to think, and that's how she got her pauper burials, is because she found a science. So there are people who know the institution that you want to cover that are not journalists. They're in the middle. Academics are sometimes some of them. And those people can make introductions to you, for you. And they can get you in the door. And so that's a great method. 2 other quick things. One is the footnotes in public reports. Because the footnotes are going to give you the raw data. And sometimes that raw data is amazing. First of all, it gives you more names, and those people are closer to the subject than the people who wrote the report, even though you're looking at the report. And the other thing, if you're doing anything that involves foreign policy or bilateral relations or anything, I would go back to Cablegate in WikiLeaks. It's still an amazing resource. It gets older and older as the years go by. But it still is really good. It's also very fun because you just find out things. You find out how countries talk to each other, who obviously find out who talks to the United States. But it's a great, it's still a great treasure trove of information. So I think that wraps it up. This is me. I also am a professor at the University of Maryland. And this organization called Press Uncuffed is my attempt to, I have my students profile an imprisoned journalist, and we're trying to, and you can go on the website, it's not been updated recently, but you can see what they do. We're trying to reach out and create an international consortium of people that want to do this kind of work and be published here, because, you know, if journalists are not going to stand up for other journalists, you know, who is? So thank you very much, and look forward to questions.
All right, thanks very much to our speakers. The whole conference is, I'm sure you've all noticed, everything's running a little late, so we're taking a sort of a flexible approach to Swiss timing here. But since there's so much to say, we had a lot to say, but I think we'll go ahead and open it up for your questions. And while you're coming to the microphones, there's one on either side. I'll start with a question from Twitter, because I think it's on a lot of our minds as we fly places and cross borders. And this is from Natasha Vizcara on Twitter, and she said, you know, are specifically any tips for when you're crossing borders? Should you use the cloud? Keep your source details out of digital devices? Is there a checklist you use? And you both touched on borders a bit. Are there specific things you want people to take away as they think about crossing international borders, particularly into places where they know there are issues?
I was recommending VeraCrypt, which is a particular software. More specifically, it allows you to hide part of your disk and only reveal the complement. So at borders, you could just give the keys for one part of your disk, which will be decrypted, and just put some sensitive documents, but not too sensitive documents, so that it appears like you have a reason for encrypting the disk, and then the rest of the disk would appear as a random part, etc. So this is in case the amount of data is very high, but obviously you can also use the internet to download once you arrived your data.
Okay. I can just add a little bit. It's really this is a great tip for if you're trying to travel with your device, but also you have to think about which border you're crossing and what rights you have and who you are, because in certain places there are privileges for journalists, attorneys, and doctors. Whether they're respected or not is a question. I think in the EU they are, but if you're faced with someone at the borders of the US who forces you to do something, I don't know if it's the best thing to resist. Actually, it's not. So maybe you can take it up later. So some of the things you can do is either have your devices completely encrypted and switched off. It makes it hard for them to open. The other thing, but also that causes a problem of when you have to give a password. But another option is to travel without your device. And if you're going to a place and have all the stuff on the cloud. And one of the devices you can use is a Chromebook, which is only online. And that way, as you're going through, you have nothing to give. But that also leaves the question of your online persona. And you have a couple of options, and depending also on where you might want to say you don't have, which might not be believable, but you might also maintain dummy accounts that you have to update once in a while, that shows you as whatever persona you want. Or you might, if you think that this is not dangerous for you to submit your social media information, you can hand it over. It depends, and that's why I think you have to evaluate that and according to the place. There's no one advice, but your position also, who you are, and also account, the race accounts for it in a lot of ways. How you look like, what you do. It's about choosing between the different techniques that are out there that are suitable to the risk that you face.
I have a question about data share, because when you are inside the consortium, you can use data share and share documents. But when you are outside, or when you want to share documents with another journalist who is not in this consortium, you cannot do that. You cannot share documents using this application. So do you plan to make a kind of extent of this application that we can use outside of the consortium?
Yes, the objective is to make it reproducible for every media in the world. This is why the project is open source, and the objective is to make as easy as possible for any media or NGO or organization to set up its own network. So that's the objective. That's not yet the case, but yes, perfectly.
And do you know when?
I would say not before the end of next year, I would say.
So end of 2020.
Maybe next year, but I would say, to be cautious, the end of the year.
Oh, okay. My question is for Dana, but if other people have answers, I'd love to hear them. So the question that I have, and I'm sure it varies based on situation, but what typically are the rules that you use when you're meeting someone face-to-face in terms of recording?
Oh, recording?
Recording, yeah. Is that like 100% no, or are there situations?
Well, in the
which you
beginning,
put
it's
on-
definitely 100% no.
Okay.
Yeah. Unless the person's, I have personally never done that, because I can't imagine the kind of people that I was talking to ever wanting to be recorded. But I also think that let's scale it back from this, people who used to work for the government or work for the government, and let's go to the other spectrum. Let's say you're doing something about a police organization or a drug company or something like that. So even if the person's going to come to you because they think something's wrong and they want to talk about it, or you meet them at the conference we were just talking about, I know that my students don't take notes very well anymore, so they automatically bring out the recorder. Right. And I've had to say, no, first of all, you're dealing usually dealing with people who are older, and so the idea that you can't not take notes. You should not be taking notes probably at all in the first. You may run to the bathroom and write some notes down, but you're trying to establish a rapport that is going to build trust. And you can't build trust overnight. The person needs to be able to judge you and how are you reacting? Just like you're judging how they react to your questions, they're judging you how you're reacting to your answers. So definitely no recording, but then you do face a lot of other things, like, can I quote you? How can I quote you? Because if the person wants to be, really the best sources want to remain anonymous throughout the whole process, but they may either give you documents, or the other thing that this is really high on my list of tricks of the trade that I learned only when I was covering the CIA, is to use people to go get you things that you cannot go get yourself. So whether it's what happened in that meeting with the director? Well, chances are you don't have 3 sources or 2 sources or even one other source who was in that meeting, and that person you're talking to was probably not in the meeting either, but they really know people who were at the meeting. And so once you get really good, once they believe in you and what you're doing, then you can ask them, and you really trust them, you can ask them, well, can you go figure out what happened in that meeting? And, the CIA calls it assets, So the CIA can't go steal secrets of another country. They can do it somewhat electronically for sure, but they use spies. That's what actually a spy is someone who does things for them. And so that's exactly that is such a great method. And I when I was covering the courthouse once, when I was a young Metro reporter, I had a clerk of the court who loved me to come around because I always had some gossip for him. Just human nature, love gossip. And he would give me stuff back. And it dawned on me that he knew everybody and everyone trusted him. He's a really great guy and he'd been around forever. So I would bring him my tips and I'd mask him a little bit and say, I heard that X happened. Really? I said, yeah. Do you think you could find that out? And he had a little pride about helping me find that out. But I always gave him something the next meeting. And it was always information, whether, something that would just be fun for him to hear.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Thanks.
All right, any other?
Oops. Hi. Continuing the sort of recruiting assets theme, have you ever had a situation where you've kind of been developing trust, the trust been going both ways, but then they've turned double agent on you, or it's not worked out, and you've been busted, as it were, for sniffing around?
Totally. And that's a hard thing to learn, but it's really important to keep in mind. Not this day and age, not only do you get busted by their organization, but you might get busted. They might give another reporter what you know. So that's my personal OPSEC, operational security, is so I am very careful giving the whole story to somebody. Like, what am I really working on? I might give them, because I need a certain element of something, just as little as I can. I don't like to lay out what it is in the end I'm working on. And sometimes you don't know what you're working on in the beginning because you can't see the whole thing. But you know that something sounded off. Something sounded really unusual. Something, I call it like the ping. I have a whole file cabinet in my brain for all the pings that, in a conversation about something totally different, someone says something that just doesn't sound, it just is one of those things, it's either the opposite of what you thought or just sounds unusual. So, I think you have to give as little as you can. And definitely try not to share the big story until you're near the end, or sometimes you need people to help you validate your own judgment. And that's when we had the most trusted people who could, in my case, help us work through whether a certain story would damage national security. Because the government was saying, you can't write about secret prisons because it'll damage national security. Our allies will never trust us again. The countries where these prisons are could be retaliated against. And so I went to people that I really trusted who'd help me with little teeny parts of the story and would say, okay, this is what the government's saying. What do you think? I mean, these were really trusted sources. And so they could kind of be your truth meter. Does that make sense?
It's really interesting.
Yeah.
You?
All right, so we've got to set you all free, but before we do, I want to ask each of the panelists if there are any final websites, resources. We've shared a lot of information here, but places you all can go to kind of take the next steps or get more practical advice. And so your presentation's online. Did everybody catch that website, or do you want to say again?
It's WCSJ19. Then datasec JM.
And do you have any?
Resources for investigative techniques and how to safely do them, including company investigations, Google dorking, web archiving. This is all on kit.exposingtheinvisible.org. So kit.exposingtheinvisible.org. It's got a beginner's guide. We have more resources for, advanced inspiration of investigation, but this should cover the basics.
Well, I have no easy way to do this, but my recommendation would be to read the either the books or the talks of people who have done investigative reporting, because they usually are giving the examples of what they did. This happened here yesterday, and I picked up this one tip from Anna. It was a great idea I never thought of, and it's just building your database of your mental database of ways to go about it. So.
Good, and so coming here was a good plan then, right, for everybody in the audience, yeah? So thank you all for attending. I think we're all willing to answer questions and stay in conversation. Thanks for doing the work, and enjoy the rest of the show.